And let's just give it, I usually give it to about 6:01 or 6:02 because that's when people roll in and.
Yep. Works for me. It was funny, the time change. I was so convinced that 6 p.m. your time was 8 a.m. my time. Better be early than late.
That's right. That's okay. With daylight savings time, it always takes me a few weeks to remember, don't call home at this time because they're still sleeping or vice versa. I see Marva. How are you, Marva?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Nice to see you.
Yes, it's been a while.
Yes, we can say that because we don't bump into anybody on campus.
I know.
Anymore. It's just we happen to be in the same virtual meeting. That's totally the case.
Are you still on campus?
Yeah. Oh, I've been here since January.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I rarely go out, which is, that can be a little tough sometimes.
I know.
Yeah, but we're getting through. I see Hadia there. Assalamu alaikum, Hadia and Amna.
Hi. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Amna. I see
How are you?
Razki as well. Akib, one of my former students. The woman named Fatima, you see here, Fatima Iftikhar, she is the, Michelle, she's the co-lead for our student partner program here, which is another big area that I've been helping to develop. So there she is, there's Fatima, AKA our, our gift from Allah here, for sure, in all things.
Thank you, Dr. Lana.
She's also helping coordinate a brand new teaching award that we have here as well. So all that fun stuff. So, which hopefully we can catch up about at another time. I see Hania. Hania, nice to see you. Hania is in our math department, the head of our math department. She's here. Not sure if she hears me, but, and then I see a couple of students. Great. Well, Michelle, why don't we get started? And I think people are just going to roll in. We had quite a few folks signing up. So I know we want to give you as much time as we can here. Oh, and I just wanted to point out Dr. Suleiman Shahid. He's the guy with the picture with the computer and the plaid shirt. He just logged in as well. He's the director for the LUMS Learning Institute. So he's here as well. And also a computer science faculty member and is, I think, quickly sneaking his way into the School of Education as well, which we're really, really glad to have him there. So welcome. Okay, well, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm so excited for this session because it's such a, we have a special guest, someone's very special to me. I'd like to welcome Michelle Ogernik from McMaster University. Michelle, I've known Michelle probably the last, I think since 2017, pretty much, give or take, a few months in there. And we work together at the McPherson Institute, which is the Teaching and Learning Center at McMaster, where you know that the VC also used to be the director there as well. So Michelle has also worked with Dr. Arshad in the past. And I think probably some of the folks that you've met before here as well. They've met Jeanette Barrington, Michelle. I'm not sure if you know Jeanette. She's been here, and Chris Lombardo was here to visit as well. So some people might know Chris. So some connections here. Michelle is currently a PhD candidate. She's almost there, everybody, in neuroscience and psychology. She does a lot of work on learning. So she might talk to you a little bit about that. And she's the lead educational development fellow at the McPherson Institute. So she did a lot of work there as a student in a student position, and then kind of has moved into this lead position as well. So she's done everything from helping faculty with course design, like some of our student partners here, to leading workshops, She's currently teaching a class similar to what I teach in SOE around pedagogy at the McPherson Institute, and that's for grad students. But the interesting thing here is Michelle, when the pandemic hit, Michelle had been teaching a first year class of 250 students. So she quickly had to, I think learn a lot and, about shifting to online, just as we were as well with shifting assessments online. And I think she's currently teaching a lab course with around 24 students. So Michelle, welcome. There's a little bit about you for everyone, and over to you for this session.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I am stoked to be meeting you all for me this morning, but for you this evening. It's always a pleasure to meet folks who are interested in teaching and learning and care about teaching and learning and network from new places. And so, like Lana said, my name is Michelle Ogronik. I am close to being finished the PhD. I think a lot of my love for teaching and learning sometimes gets in the way of finishing up, but I wouldn't change it for the world. As Lana said, I'm currently teaching a fourth year seminar course at McMaster. It is called Cognitive Neuroscience of Exercise, which is kind of where my general research sits. I'm interested in the science of learning. I'm interested in health psychology, and I'm generally, most of my research centers on how we can think about our bodies and how they connect to our brains and how we can leverage that information to help folks, whether it be improving memory, sustaining focus, those sorts of things. And so I combined kinesiology, or the study of the body, with psychology and neuroscience, the study of the brain. And it's super fun to see how it plays out in the world of learning. I'm excited to chat with you today about multiple choice questions. Yes, it is something that is quite near and dear to my heart. As Lana said earlier, I was teaching it was actually a second year course in health psychology, 250 students, the pandemic hit. And typically that course, because it's a big course, runs with assessments that are multiple choice based. I don't have a lot of teaching assistant support for that class. And, you need to assess students in some way that is also feasible for you to actually get that grading done. And I'm very thankful that I've had some previous training in writing strong multiple choice questions from a professor named Dr. Joe Kim. He is the head of our introductory psychology program at McMaster, where typically in any course, there can be like 2,000 to 3,000 students. And so under his supervision and under the supervision of Dr. Amy Pachai, who is also an incredible human being, but she is a PhD in psych neuroscience and behavior too, and works as an educational developer. They've taught me a whole bunch. And so I'm very thankful to be sharing some of that information with you. So I'm going to share my screen now, but please feel free to ask questions along the way. Lana, if at any point I miss questions in the chat, feel free to interrupt me. I'm hoping that folks feel comfortable to ask as you need. So before I get into the content also for this, I keep wanting to say this morning, for this evening, I want to also give a great shout out to Dr. Stephanie Verkoyen. She is currently on mat leave, but she's also a educational developer at McPherson. And she helped me revive my old workshop related to multiple choice questions and put a lot of work into some of the slides that you'll see today. And so wanted to give her that shout out and thank her for her work. So I'm assuming folks can see my slides. Lana, are we all good? Okay, fabulous. So no surprise, starting off a workshop or conversation about teaching and learning. We'll see some intended learning outcomes. But I'm hoping that by the end of the next 30 minutes or so, you may be able to recognize some effective multiple choice questions, stems, and answers. And we'll talk about some of that language shortly. And that you'll discover maybe some new ways to apply multiple choice beyond just rote memory or recall, and think about maybe moving into that applied piece. So I'm curious if maybe folks can share in the chat, what are some of the reasons that you either yourself have used multiple choice questions before, or why you think multiple choice is useful? Just gonna stop sharing my screen for a second so I can see the chat. You're also welcome to unmute yourself and share if that's more comfortable to you. We do it for marketing surveys, certainly. It's a great way to get some quick responses there. For assessments, I usually use multiple choice to help students apply theory points. That's awesome, Amna. Quick and automated, mainly reading checks. Certainly the quick and automated piece is such a pull to use multiple choice. For pre and post assessments and lessons, it helps in large classes, certainly. And it's quick and easy to review, especially if marked digitally. These are all awesome and spot on the money, where a big reason, or typically when I use multiple choice assessments, it's a combination of potentially quick checks for surveys, thinking about it in the context of big classes and feasibility. And let me just reshare my slide. Sorry, sometimes Zoom is a little bit sassy with me, but we got it. It's okay. Like you had all said, this idea of being quick to grade and that they can be graded objectively, that's a pretty useful point too, where sometimes, students can feel like they want to have conversations about every little nitpicky point, whereas multiple choice, it's either yes or no for the most part. They're easy to create multiple versions of. So if you have big classes, and if you remember back to in-person tests when you would give out multiple different versions of that test in the classroom. And it can be useful to pinpoint who understands what, where if you create questions related to particular topics, if there's general topics that don't seem to perform well, or particular students who are struggling, they're pretty useful for thinking about both individual students and individual concepts. And they can test a breadth of knowledge, and we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of our conversation this morning. But the key to taking advantage of the strengths of multiple choice is actually writing good questions. You'll see often students saying things to the effect of, oh, multiple choice, they're not great. They don't actually test that I know the content, or instructors saying, they're too easy. They're just doing things that they can just quickly search online, for example, particularly in that remote context. And so talking about how we can move beyond recall into applied and write strong questions can help us harness a lot of these benefits. So before getting into some of my tips, we should talk a little bit about the language that I'll use. So in terms of the anatomy of a multiple choice question. So here's an example of a question. And typically when using, or when talking about multiple choice, the question will be referred to as the stem, or sometimes the question, but stem is commonly used. And then A, B, C, D are referred to as options. When we think about within the options, we have our answer. So for example, in this case, the answer is A. And the options that are not the key or correct answer are typically referred to as distractors. So the language that I'll use is stem, option, answer, and distractors. Feeling okay so far? I see some nods. We're doing all right. Okay. So as I said earlier, I can't talk about multiple choice questions without giving credit to Joe and Dr. Amy Pachai. I also want to reference Dr. David DiBattista. So a lot of the content that I was trained on and that I'm presenting today comes from key ideas and theories from his work. And so if you wanted to take a look at further readings or references, that would be a name that I would start with. But let's get started with first thinking about the stem, or the question. So I'm going to provide an example question that we're going to edit together and come up, or I'll share 3 kind of tips on how I typically edit or will review questions. So here's an example of a question that is related to my area. And it says, thinking about the amazing prefrontal cortex, which includes 8 of Brodmann's identified and interesting areas, is primarily responsible for. And then there are 4 options below. A is our answer, and B, C, and D are distractors. Now, when we think about whether you know this content or not and have the domain-specific knowledge, not relevant. Let's think about the actual STEM as we see it, and ways to start maybe improving the quality of this question. And so you can see right now that there are a couple of adjectives that aren't really necessary. do they need to know that the prefrontal cortex is amazing or that Brodmann's identified areas are interesting? I would argue probably not. And the more we can trim that question stem, the better students are going to be able to focus and harness and latch on to the key points that we want them to think about. And so the first step that I would suggest is remove any unnecessary bits of your sentence. So we can get rid of the amazing prefrontal cortex, we can get rid of interesting, to essentially use clear and simple sentences. And that I don't think is a surprise to folks. So first tip, just make sure that you're thinking using clear and simple sentences. In the same way you would go back and edit your own writing, having someone else perhaps or yourself look at your question stem and say, is this clear? Do I need this additional descriptor? If the answer is no, like, for example, there might be some cases where you need it. So if there's something related to a particular color or a particular sensation you need to describe, that's okay. But if not necessary, remove. So now we're left with the stem that says the prefrontal cortex, which includes 8 of Brodmann's identified areas, is primarily responsible for. Now that we've cleaned up some of those unnecessary pieces, there's still some additional irrelevant information that we can remove here. Understanding that the prefrontal cortex includes 8 of those identified or Brodmann's identified areas isn't necessary in order for them to answer the question. And so just like the unnecessary descriptors, if there's any details that are relevant but not necessary for actually understanding what the question is asking and being able to answer, I say get rid of those too. And so here you can see that we'll cut this part out. And now we've really synthesized and focused on what the key element of this question is. What is the prefrontal cortex primarily responsible for? And so second tip, avoid any unnecessary information, not just the descriptors, but unnecessary information. Okay. So now we've got a quite smaller question stem, where we ask, or we say the prefrontal cortex is primarily responsible for. The final tip that I would suggest for thinking about question stems, and you've probably seen some multiple choice questions that look like this with either like a ... or even you might have seen slide or questions where you might say like the prefrontal cortex : and then there's a whole bunch of answers that you need to try and map to that question stem. One of the issues when we present a question or when we present a stem that doesn't have a complete idea means that students need to keep in their working memory that stem every time they go back to one of the options, where they would have to say, if we go back to the previous slide, the prefrontal cortex is primarily responsible for complex thought and decision making. Okay, the prefrontal cortex is primarily responsible for processing information about temperature and touch, and so on and so forth. Whereas if we switch this to a specific and targeted and complete question at the outset of the stem, the student knows what you're asking for. And so it kind of takes away that additional load on their part to have to map the stem to the options. And instead, they know what you're asking, and now they can just go through the options to try and figure out which one aligns best with that answer. And so generally in DiBattista's work, and that I've seen success for students just anecdotally, having a complete question in your stem will help alleviate any ambiguity, will help ensure that students are focused on that target question. And generally, I think it allows students to know exactly what you want from them up front, rather than having to puzzle piece their way through part of that stem and part of those options. So generally, for creating a better stem, make sure you're using clear and simple sentences, get rid of anything that's not necessary, and ask a complete question where possible. So now we've talked a little bit about successful stems. Let's move into options. And I find that, at least for myself, coming up with the options is part of the most challenging piece of multiple choice questions, where you might know what you want to ask students, but trying to figure out what's the best way to not only give them the answer, but to think critically about that answer can be hard. And so I hope these next 3 tips will be helpful. So you've probably seen multiple choice questions that look like this too, where we have our STEM, which asks, which of the following treatments would be most effective at reducing a cocaine addict's compulsion to use cocaine during the first week of sobriety? Targeted question, nothing there is unnecessary. For context, the piece around like that first week is necessary for their actual learning. So all this to say, I feel pretty okay with the STEM. But then when we look to the options, there's a lot to work through. And the first piece of advice or first tip that I'll share is typically what I do is I have no more than 4 options, and I never use all of the above, none of the above, or combinations for the most part. And that's because students in those cases can sometimes rely on partial knowledge to figure their way out of that question rather than actually knowing all of that content well. Where if a student knows that I don't think B is right, so I can get rid of E and F and H, but they don't actually know what the key correct answer is. They're kind of using their puzzle piece knowledge to get there. That's one of the downsides of some of those like combination answers. And generally, there's a term sometimes used in the literature called test-wise students, which describes students who are smart and good at taking tests and may not necessarily know the content super well, but they know how to work through the tests we provide, and good on them, key skills. But if we want the assessment to actually get at their understanding of the concepts we're trying to convey, a lot of test-wise students know that if all of the above or none of the above are included, often those end up being related to the answer. And if a test-wise student, if there's all of the above as an option, if they can eliminate A, they know that that's not right, rather than actually knowing that A, B, C, and D are correct or not correct in that way. So all this to say, removing all of the above or none of the above or those combos will help ensure that the students who are answering your question actually know that content and aren't using partial information to get the right answer. So typically, I avoid all of the above or none of the above. And it also reduces the amount of options that students need to read through. And so they can spend the time that you've allotted on that assessment to actually read through the options that you care about the most, rather than puzzle piece thinking. So now we've got 4 options here. We have A, B, C, which is our keyed answer, and D, where A, B, and D are all distractors. Now, when you read these answers, these options, you can see that some are kind of an easy giveaway. My students in my class will know that nothing we talk about is related to sneezing sensations. They know that most of the time we don't describe receptors as angry. And so, where it might feel like you're adding in, if you're adding in pieces to your distractors that are too easy or too giveaway, it's not even worth it to put them there, because students will just rule them out so quickly and they don't have to critically think about that option provided. And so a quick and easy way that we could improve the options as they are here is to remove things, in my case, related to sneezing or angry. But the key take home of this suggestion is to include plausible distractors. So things that could be real or that really do relate to what the concept you're trying to assess is. And that takes a lot of work. Writing plausible distractors is one of the hardest pieces of multiple choice writing, but that's where you're really going to get your students from picking out an easy answer to actually having to think about the concept that you're assessing. Next piece here that I'll share. So we've got our STEM and we've got our options that have been modified. One of the things that I really, I find successful when I'm using multiple choice questions in my class is to think about the length of those options and the level of detail you provide in those options. There should be across your options a similar level of detail and a similar level or a similar length, because often what students will do is, in this case, I was being conscious about that issue, but typically when students will see one of the options that is really detailed and fits really well and the rest are kind of short, they'll lean towards that longer option because they know that you've put in the effort to give that option content and descriptors that make sense to that question. And so I would highly encourage you to think about the length and the level of detail and complexity for each of your options. And so if we modify this question, I could remove all of this additional content and just ask, or just have in option D, a drug that blocks dopamine receptors. Now, my final tip, if we move forward to this now cleaned version, one of the things that I find really successful when I'm using multiple choice questions to ensure that the students who get it are getting it right, and the students who don't know it need to rework some of this content, is thinking about paired options. So here you can see, if you read the question, which of the following statements would be most effective at reducing cocaine addicts' compulsion to use cocaine during the first week of sobriety? Options C and D have a drug that blocks dopamine transporters and a drug that blocks dopamine receptors. And so here students need to know, is it transporters or is it receptors? For options A and B, I have something that will alter dopamine transporters to ensure decreased uptake, and a drug that decreases the number of receptors. Here we might consider actually reworking option A to create paired options that students need to work through. And let me show you what I mean. So here, if instead for option A, I include something to the effect of a drug that increases the number of dopamine transporters. Here now you can see, this is how a student has to think about this question. They'll either, at the start, they'll have to think, is it something that blocks or is it something that increases or decreases? That's the first thing they need to consider. Then they need to understand, is it a transporter or is it a receptor? So here, just with 4 options and a multiple choice question, I am getting students to understand this pathway in the course that I'm teaching them, to know 2 different levels of that pathway. What would this drug do? Would it block, increase, or decrease? And what is it affecting, a transporter or receptor? And so here, when you have these paired options where possible, it makes students think along that continuum of the concepts that you're trying to communicate to them. And so where possible, it's not always feasible with the content that you're working with, but paired options sometimes help to make sure that students are actually getting that key piece of the puzzle that you want them to understand. So overall, the tips for creating better options: avoid all of the above or none of the above where possible, include plausible distractors, and ensure that those options are similar in content, length, and complexity. So now we've talked about the options, we've talked about the stems. Maybe what we'll move into now is talking about moving beyond recall. I'm hoping that this will take maybe 10 minutes or so, 10, 15. So we'll still have some time to talk about your questions or specific examples that you have, if that works. What do we have in the chat? Apparently SAT developers like to do the do nots being shared today. Someone please train them. Yeah, don't even get me started about standardized tests. I have very strong feelings and opinions, but certainly there could be some work there. But anyways, thinking about moving beyond recall. Stephanie and I, when designing this workshop before, we came up with a couple of ideas of ways to move beyond recall. So in my previous example, I used this option using a real world scenario. So I had this idea of a new drug, or thinking about, this new drug or how it applies to this pathway. That's an example of a real world scenario that you can use. But depending on your content, you might also consider an analysis of visuals and how you can improve, rather just like, which part of the body is this? Or which part of the computer is this? How can we move thinking about analysis of visuals beyond just recall? And I'll show you an example. And we can also think about thinking about how folks are required to give an answer and a why, that explanation piece, which can be included in multiple choice questions, even though they might not be giving the explanation themselves. They need to identify the key explanation or the key understanding as to the why. So let's get into some examples which might help make that more concrete. So here's an example of a recall question. What is the first concern of an emergency worker? In this example, a student would just need to memorize an abstract fact. What is the first concern if you are training to be an emergency worker? But again, one of the best ways I think to analyze higher order thinking is to use real world scenarios where possible. So an example of how this could be modified beyond recall to thinking about an applied piece is by providing a scenario. So here the question asks, you arrive at the scene of an accident where people are panicked and yelling. 3 people appear to be injured. 1 person has scrapes and bruises. A second is lying on the ground in pain, and a third is losing blood from a skull injury. Who do you take care of first? And so here, again, this idea of that first concern of emergency worker, preserving life or whatever it may be. I don't pretend to be an emergency worker, but thankful for all of our emergency workers doing so much hard work right now. Here they have to think in triage like an emergency worker to come up with what that first concern is and then apply it to the person. If I was working on this STEM, I might actually condense the first two sentences where it says, you arrive at the scene of an accident where people are panicked and yelling, 3 people appear to be injured. A way you can condense this could be something like, you arrive at the scene of an accident where 3 people are injured. Do I care that people are panicked and yelling? Not really. But the key piece here is those 3 people who are injured. Here's what they're going through. Who do you triage first? And in this way, your question is getting at that applied piece rather than having to remember preserve life. They show who and how they're going to preserve life. And I think that is a pretty cool example. Let's talk a little bit about thinking about visuals. And that's not something I commonly use in my own teaching, but I know it is common in other disciplines and faculties. And so a before question might look like, what are all the components of a computer's video system? And select all that apply. And they have a bunch of different pieces and they have to click on the pieces that are necessary. Here again, this recall piece is quite clear. Pick the ones that align with what you remember. But in order to move this beyond recall and think about higher order thinking, we could consider a question that says something like this. Using the repair flow chart shown here, and you show them a repair flow chart, what should you check if the monitor stops working? So here you're still looking at the video system, the monitor, but where do you check? Where do you go? Again, this idea of getting them to think beyond what are the components, but what do each of the components mean? What do they do? And how would you start problem solving if they stopped working? So here's an example of analysis of visuals. Interestingly, and again, not something I commonly use in my own discipline, but I think is a really neat idea and something that sometimes we use in the Office of Community Engagement. I've seen it used or related to teaching and learning teaching. So courses like what Lana is teaching or what I'm teaching for grad students. But here you might ask students, let's say, to watch a couple of videos or listen to a couple of audio clips and ask them to select the best. Or sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm telling you the cool answer. In the before setting, you might ask them to select the best definition of active learning. What is the definition? And that in itself is pretty recall, right? You memorize a definition, you read the options, you pick the definition that you remember. But a way that you could move this beyond recall and think about that higher order piece could be providing a video and ask them to pick which of the videos that they watch demonstrate active learning the best with someone who's really angry. And I think here again, it moves beyond just like knowing what the definition of active learning is to understanding what it looks like in practice. What does someone who's really doing a good job of active listening look like? And I think you can later pair this with the why, and I'll show you an example right after this. But please know, and we can talk about, I think I'll mention this a little bit later, but when you provide these sorts of questions for students, they take longer to do. And so you need to keep that in mind when you're considering how many questions you include and how long is the test. But I think it's worth it when considering a student will actually know what this might look like in practice in comparison to just a definition they read from a page. Now, finally, this idea of answer and why is what we've been calling it. In this before example, we ask students to name 3 qualities of effective entrepreneurs. And, here they need to list 3 qualities. They need to have memorized and able to recall what makes an effective entrepreneur. A way we can move this beyond recall into higher order might be a question that looks like this. Review the financials of these 3 startup companies. Which one would you invest in and why? And so they need to put their entrepreneur cap on and think like an effective entrepreneur rather than knowing the 3 qualities that make them effective. You need to know those qualities and think about how you would actually use them in practice. So review these finances and be able to identify, I don't pretend to be an effective entrepreneur myself, but they would need to be able to identify in their context and in their discipline, which startup company they'd invest in. And you can have in your options something to the effect of like company A because of this, company, maybe I might not even give them 3, I might give them 2, maybe 3. I don't know. It would depend on how complex I'd want the options to be. But you can even give them like option company 1, and here's why. Company 1, and here's why. And those whys can be different and maybe not necessarily aligned with those key qualities you're looking for. So you can think strategically about making sure students not only identify the correct startup, but also understand why that startup is the best. So overall, when thinking about moving beyond recall, you need to think about the type of knowledge you actually want students to evaluate. And this is a great time to go back to your course's intended learning outcomes. Do you want students to be able to evaluate something? Do you want them to be able to identify something? Or do you want them to be able to differentiate? Those sort of action verbs and the key learning you want them to take away can in turn influence how you choose to structure and write your multiple choice questions. But like I said earlier, know that these questions not only take typically longer for students to answer, and so you'll need to maybe have fewer questions on your assessment or give them more time, but they also take longer to write. And so thinking about quality over quantity can be really important, though I completely recognize the challenges with that when if you're running an assessment and you're using open book and you want to have a lot of them so your quiz bank can pull from multiple, this isn't something that is going to be perfect overnight. So you might even want to set yourself up for success if you're new to multiple choice question writing or want to update your current question bank to having a couple of these key moving beyond recall questions that at least you put a couple on your student's assessment. Giving yourself baby steps. I'm not asking you to completely throw out all the hard work you've done in the past and start from scratch when instructors and students are going through it. There is a lot on your plates and we're all tired and burnt out from a very, very long year. So please know that I hope these tips and suggestions have been useful to consider, but I don't want you to feel overwhelmed and go back to your work and feel like you have to do everything perfectly immediately. Apply these as you go and apply them as you see fit. But that's it in terms of content from me. I always love to chat, so you're welcome to take my email. Lana knows where to find me too, if you ever wanted to chat. But I wanted to make sure that we had some time and space to talk about questions that you might have about actually designing some of your own content. And if anything was unclear or you'd like to talk further, I'm excited. So let me stop sharing my screen, head back to see all of you, and let me know what questions you have or what would be useful to talk about.
Thank you, Michelle. You definitely had us thinking and working through things with you there. So clearly you've written some good questions for us. Suleiman has a question. Go ahead.
Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very, I think, refreshing and a timely presentation. I think we're all heading towards our finals. So
yep.
I think this quick refresher can be very helpful. You know, I just wanted to sort of highlight one thing, which is very important. You also mentioned that, you know, in my university, maybe 10 years ago, there was this scheme that our MCQs would be randomly checked by a teaching and learning center. You know, so we have to submit our MCQs to a teaching and learning center, and they will evaluate the quality, and they'll run some statistical checks to see, you know, if we're doing a good job. And my MCQs were also selected, and it turned out that mine was one of the worst ones I had designed as a PhD student. And one of the things they found out in my MCQs was the dark patterns of confusing students. You know, and these dark patterns are that you test by confusing, and then you feel pride in creating confusion because you think you're testing something. And that's really the antithesis of the whole MCQ thing, that you don't want to confuse, you actually want to check the right knowledge, you know, with a minimum amount of effort and energy, so that, you know, they can pay attention to the other things which are a part of your larger exam. So I really wanted to highlight this thing, that these dark patterns, both in the design of the MCQ STEM, but more importantly in distractors, are very common, and I think we sometimes intentionally or unintentionally do it. I think you nicely highlighted that. My question, which I wanted to learn from you, is actually about the why questions. This is something I you know, started introducing post-COVID, because when you go online, the chances of, you know, the bad word which we shouldn't use, cheating or you know, or getting help, unwanted help, you know, is getting higher. So what you want to test is that, you know, other than getting to know from your friend is E or A or B or C, you know, there's a justification of your answer. And what I'm not sure about, that having the why question is a replacement of a standard descriptive question, because we usually have this standard descriptive question where we want you to explain a particular theoretical concept, and we say that explain in your own words, you know, what do you understand from this particular thing. So that question sometimes is being shown without any option. But then when you bring option, does it actually add value to this descriptive question? Does it become a different type of a question because it does something different? How do these two are related to each other? How these two are different from each other? So I would love to have some opinion on that.
That is such a great question, but I want to first acknowledge your honesty and thank you for your honesty related to those original multiple choice questions. You are not the only instructor, and certainly other folks that I've worked with who, in the past, this idea of like getting students, haha, like I have made a good question because I know that only a few are getting it right, isn't necessarily the best approach. And I so appreciate your honesty. We didn't talk about it today, but if you're interested, for folks who want to learn more, there's some interesting work where you can look at the discriminatory power of your question, where you actually analyze and see, you know, how many students get each option right, and are those students some of your top performers? Are they not? To see whether your options were actually doing the work, and was your question actually doing a good job, while not necessarily confusing students, but making sure those who actually get the content are getting it right.
Sorry, Michelle, quickly here. We had a rule in our previous university that if 95 or 93% of students are getting it wrong, you have to drop the question. So we really had that rule, and this was sort of an unsaid rule, but our department followed that. You know, so we had to check the statistics, and very often we'll ending up dropping questions where our top performers are not doing very well, or most of the class is getting it wrong. You know, and then we have to check back. We have to justify, because legally these 2 marks are students' right. So we, you know, our department had gone to that level actually. So it's a very good point you raised. Sorry for the distractor.
No, I think that's useful, and it's something that I've actually shared with students in the past. I remember I was writing a new midterm where a lot of the questions had new content, and I shared with them, you know, if 80 or 90% of you are getting this question wrong, that means that I haven't done a good job with this question and I will drop it. And I ended up dropping 2 of them from the midterm because I didn't feel like it was a fair assessment, even though some of my top performers were getting, like the 5 of them who got it right. But it meant that something was missing there from how I either wrote the question or described that content for students to be able to engage with it. Typically, I'll flag questions for myself that actually I have less than 75% of students getting it right. Or sorry, not 75% of them getting it right. At least 25% of my students have to be getting that question right. If I have anything lower than that, then I'm worried. Now, to go back to your point related to thinking about, an open-ended question versus the multiple choice and that why, I don't know if I have a perfect answer, but I'm happy to share my opinion where, a good open-ended question where you're asking them to describe the theory in their own words is getting at a different piece than having them identify one of 2 whys, right? Like if a student has to free explain on their own terms something in comparison to, picking options, certainly that is a little bit different. But I think a lot of multiple choice has to go back to feasibility and has to go back to also thinking about ways to be thoughtful about, you talked about students actually knowing the why. Some option or some examples that I've seen instructors use is, you might give a scenario at the start, the financial reports of these different companies, and they have to pick which company and why. I've seen some instructors to ensure that the student is actually identifying the proper company and why, switching up the titles and names of the companies. So that way it shows that they've actually read which ones were theirs and understood the why. So they might switch up the name with which financial piece it's put, and it pulls randomly for each student. But to go back to your original point, I think multiple choice can assess beyond recall, but if you are looking for a student to be able to describe in their own words a particular really important theory, the multiple choice might not get at that same level in comparison to the free open text for sure. And if you have the instructional support to be able to mark some of those, I really love having a combination of multiple choice and open-ended and other ways, because some students will say something to the effect of, like, I just don't test well this way. And while learning styles are not real, I think that there is some merit to how students approach and think about questions based on their own previous experiences with assessment. And so when there's options or when you have the flexibility, if you have the support to provide multiple ways of showing that content, whether it be picking a multiple choice question and then also describing in your own words, that's awesome. So I really appreciate your reflections and I hope I answered your question. Is there other follow-ups that thumbs up? Okay, fabulous. Amna, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, first of all, thank you. Amazing content, and this was really needed at this particular time. My issue is that see, because those of us who sometimes we've been involved in designing these horrifying standardized tests, and I'm very against those. But so what we've been told is that, okay, when you write out the options, so consider that one is the correct answer, right? One needs to be a completely wrong one. Then two of them need to be they're in the middle. So they're like very close to one would be, so it's like levels, completely wrong, slightly wrong, correct, and so on. So usually we're given these 4 categories that we fit our options into. Yep. Now, don't you think that's do you really? I'm not too sure if that's how we should be doing this, and I find that to be very uncomfortable. So do you think you could just help out here? Should we just throw this complete thing out the window?
I can give my own personal opinions on this, but again, everyone has their own space and place for this. I think when you structure a multiple choice question to have the right one, the medium ones, and then the really wrong ones, for most students who are test wise or even know the content at a very surface level, they're very quickly able to get rid of that very wrong one.
Yeah.
And then that leaves them only with 3, let's say. And the often I find, and this is anecdotally, when you're making those medium answers, it's hard to make a really medium one that is set very different from that actual right one. And so, you know, again, it's not getting students to critically engage in the same way as if you had plausible distractors that were centered around you knowing this key concept. And so some of them, like in the examples I was showing you, one of them is very, very wrong. But if they don't understand the fundamentals of that pathway, it could look really right to them, and it could look very possible to them. And so I guess what I'll say is, as long as the very wrong one for students who don't actually know the content could be right, I think that's okay. I think a lot of standardized tests approach multiple choice questions, not necessarily thinking about moving beyond the recall and getting into the applied piece, but they're thinking about the number of questions and the timing. And they've got to get a lot of questions in a short amount of time. And that's how you really assess learning. But when we think about some students who take longer time to process, or folks who are really good at memorizing and can rip through those questions, but not necessarily really be able to critically engage with that content, I often worry about the role of standardized tests there, and not even thinking, that doesn't even touch the surface of thinking about the inequities of approaching standardized tests for folks who have access to prep materials and who don't, and all that sort of thing. But generally what I would say is, I don't think that approach is inherently wrong. It can be problematic depending on what those actual options are. But I think as long as the key goal is focusing on making sure students have to think thoughtfully, think critically about those options. And if the one that's wrong could be right for someone who doesn't get what you actually are really want them to know, then I think it's a possible approach, but not my favorite.
Right. So it is, again, aim dependent, goal dependent, and the quality of the option. Great.
Exactly.
Thank you so much.
Exactly. Thank you for your question. I appreciate it.
Marva, you have a question?
Okay. Thank you so much. This has been really helpful. So like 2-3 points essentially really hit me, because especially like Dr. Suleiman, I've been very guilty of making questions which confuse the students and being like, haha, they got it wrong. So I mean, the law school, there's like 2 things I was hoping you could shed a little more light on, because I teach in the law school, and then there's a certain set of MCQs or types of MCQs that, or even just like long essay questions that you get there, right? So even if you're preparing them, I mean, there's certain types of questions I would still want to give them, so that if they go for grad school, they're able to attend them. It's not the first time they're, seeing those types of questions. But that objective aside, so number one, you talked about distractors, right? But like our questions are framed in a way that there's going to be a lot of distracting evidence within the question itself, because you want the students to be able to identify which information is relevant and irrelevant. So initially I was thinking maybe it doesn't apply, but then I recalled like some of my own exams where the MCQ question was half a page long. So I was thinking you don't need to be that long in your distractions. So I think that was very helpful, because it made me very cognizant about how much information should actually be there, right? So like how much is relevant and how much is irrelevant, and also comparing that with how much time has been awarded to them. The other thing is that another type of questions we tend to give are where all the options are correct, and we ask them to choose the most correct option. So in terms of learning outcomes, I was wondering if you could, shed some light in terms of how effective or ineffective you think these types of questions are.
Great question. And to go back to your first point related to like the amount of distracting information, I'm not saying that it's, I think, and you bring up such a great point. Sometimes you need that distracting information because it's part of the assessment. I want you to be able to ignore the distracting information and pull out the key work. And so I think it's certainly appropriate there. But thinking about what distracting information is the most important distracting information speaks to your reflection. So thanks for sharing. When thinking about the most correct ones, I don't know if I've come across any like empirical evidence, so I can just speak again to my own perspective. So take that with a grain of salt. Again, I think with law, it's probably a little trickier for me. I'm testing things like pathways, theories, concepts, and it's a little more black and white than I'm sure what you experience, which is gray, and that's a lot of gray. And so I think in your context, those sorts of questions may be useful because you're trying, part of the outcome or the learning is probably getting your students to think, you know, there's lots of right ways to go about this, but which one would you be best for your client or best for your firm or whatever that looks like. And so I think contextually it makes a lot of sense. I think it again goes back to kind of what we were speaking about with Amna is, you know, the quality of those options and distractors though. So if you find your students are split 50-50 on two of the options when you asked for them to pick which one was the most correct, to me there, that signals either there's something in the options that is amiss, where it's not clear, even though that they all could be right ways to go about it, which one is the best way, or that they don't know which actually is the best way from there. And that speaks to, you know, what's the next steps for your delivery of term with respect to content. And so I would never say nix those sorts of questions altogether or get rid of. But I would say just make sure that you're thinking critically about the back end, looking at who's getting those questions right, what are they missing, and making sure that those options are plausible, but also students are able to actually differentiate with what's the real goal. Typically, I don't recommend instructors thinking about the most correct unless that's tied to the actual like learning they need to do. And for you, that makes a ton of sense because lawyers sometimes need to go through some of that gray zone. And so I hope that's a useful reflection, but I'm open to other questions if you have them.
No, this was really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Marva.
So we have Michelle for a few more minutes. If there's any other questions, these have been excellent questions. And Michelle, thank you for sharing your experiences and your answers. I have a quick question. I'm just wondering, Amna, go ahead first.
Thank you. I don't know if this is actually a question or just plain stupidity on my part, but because I have recently been designing MCQs for a standardized test against my will, so they keep talking about test difficulty, question difficulty, and then they're talking about, okay, a difficult question and a medium question and an easy question. And what they keep saying to us is that, all right, if you have it's not just the complex information that in the question that makes it difficult, but it's the language you're using. Use tougher language, complex language in terms of even maybe vocabulary or convoluted sentences. Do you really think that's ethical to do something like that just to make a question difficult? I'm finding it that I'm doing things that are unethical, and I don't know. This is not the right forum, but I just came to my head that isn't that not okay when we are designing questions?
No, you are asking all the tough questions and all the good questions. So
Sorry.
No, that is meant to be a compliment. You originally said that this question is either a stupid question. No, this is a very thoughtful question. When I think about level of difficulty, what comes to mind for me is thinking about Bloom's taxonomy or thinking about, you know, the difference between recall to applied sort of thing. And so typically the way I categorize my multiple choice questions, that in the past I've seen other instructors and learned from them, is to categorize them into either applied or recall. And that's what we do. When I think about making things more difficult just based on the language you present, to me, that is problematic unless them knowing that particular language is part of the assessment. If you are just adding in words that some people might not know and some people do know, I think to me, that would signal some pretty serious concerns about kind of like what you said, ethics, but thinking about like who would know those words and who wouldn't, and why would they know those words and who wouldn't, and how does that relate to inequality? You know, like I think that comes to mind certainly as a concern. And you know, there are going to be more, even within applied and recall, there will be more challenging ones and more easy ones, and that's okay. I think it requires instructors or designers to know that content well and to know which concepts are more that students struggle with more. But I think if it were me and I was designing those multiple choice questions, I always try to use the most simplistic language that communicates the idea that folks will understand. And so that way they are not getting the question wrong because they don't understand what a word means if that word doesn't matter. So sometimes I have words in there that is like, this is a key concept. You may have never heard this word before, but we talked about it in class. And so if you don't know that word, I can't tell you what that word means because you should know it. But if it's just simply like semantics, I try to always use clear language that I think most of my learners will know. And if I am in a test environment where a student says, this was more in person, but where a student might say like, oh, what does this word mean? Or like I had in an example when I was a TA in my undergrad, I remember there was a student who asked me in a question what the color or what the word copper meant, I think it was. They were asking what the color looked like. And that wasn't really relevant to the question, and if I recall, and I remember just giving them the answer to it, or like giving them a different word, because to me, whether they know that word or not isn't assessing that content piece. But if it in a case where a student needs to know that word, I wouldn't tell them the definition. Yeah. Anyways, this is all long-winded answer to say,
thank you. No, it's really helpful.
Always ideal.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. It is 7:01, so I understand if people do have to go on to your evenings, please do. What we do have a couple more questions, Michelle, if you're okay with that, if you have time. So there's a comment from Hamayu in the chat box. Maybe people can just take a look at that about Amna's statement. And then we have from Afreen, how would one design MCQs from a range, many readings coming from various research that won't really baffle students from varied abilities? So I think this is about how do you cover a lot of, content that you're teaching in a course in a test or in an MCQ test.
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't know if I have a perfect answer, but I can share my approach. So when I think about combining work, and when I think about all the different concepts that we share, typically in your courses, you'll find some content is kind of more standalone. They need to know this. Whereas others is, this, and then you can scaffold it to this, and then it helps you know this. And so what I try and do for myself is think about key concepts that students are learning and how they connect. If there are key connections that I need them to understand that make sense together, I'll often use those questions or those content to create one question. So if they need to know X relates to Y, those are going to be the concepts that I combine in one single multiple choice question. But very rarely will I have a multiple choice question that combines every single piece of knowledge that they've learned in my course. There will be combinations of questions that assess different pieces or different pieces together. But Afreen, to your point, I would suggest maybe taking that pressure off yourself to create one question that covers everything, and know that you have the space and capacity, hopefully, to ask a couple of questions. And in those couple of questions, combining a couple of pieces here and there can overall help you cover most of the content in your course. But all this to say, it's not easy. Thinking about how you combine content within one question is a challenging piece. And I would suggest starting with thinking about your own core concepts and which ones do you need students to know of how they relate and combine to each other. And from there, thinking about why do they need to know those pieces of content together, and what would that look like in practice? And then thinking about what that looks like in practice can help inspire you to maybe think about a question stem that's a bit more applied. And then there's one other question in the chat. How would you weigh the multiple choice questions according to the level of difficulty? Because some tests mark the incorrect answer negatively. What's your opinion? I have, in my own practice and in most practice that I've seen, I've never seen students lose marks for not getting the question right. I've only ever seen them earn marks, but that might be just how. So in my classes, I set very, very clearly with students that in the course, they don't start with any marks and they are earning marks as they go. That is their job. It's not like they start at 100 and they take marks away, because I think sometimes that's where students get into that mentality of like, oh, well, why did you take this mark away from me? Versus when I approach that conversation, it's okay, well, you didn't earn full marks here because. And I think that's generally a practice I try to keep within my teaching. And so in order to honor that part of what I do, I don't ever take away marks for not getting the correct answer. They can only ever earn marks. And I don't necessarily know, again, within the literature, what's the right approach. That's just how I align my assessment with my beliefs about how they come to the classroom. Does that answer your question, Marva? Or no, it wasn't Marva, it was Maid. Okay, awesome. The culture of analyzing students is predominantly in our culture. It does first effect learning. Just wanted to say this. Thanks for sharing, Amna. I appreciate that. And it's not just within your culture, I think, or in Pakistan. It's true in Canada too, where I think students feel, and sometimes instructors approach the classroom as a place where they're not earning, they are losing. And every place that they can lose a mark is how they end up with their final grade. Whereas again, this idea of earning marks, showing your knowledge, displaying where you're at, and leveling up rather than knocking someone down, I think is an important contextual piece that you can both communicate and show within your practice.
Thank you. Michelle, if I can just ask you one question to kind of like tie this together. What, from your experience over the years of doing this and being a student yourself, and what are students saying? You know, if you can answer that, like, what are they saying about, you know, bad testing experiences, and then what are they saying about good testing experiences? What do you hear?
This is very anecdotal. So again, my experiences and the students that I've worked with, I will say that sometimes when students come to my class and they work on these multiple choice questions, the first test is challenging for them because they haven't experienced multiple choice questions that move beyond recall and that require them to apply their knowledge. And so they'll say something to the effect of like, there was so much to read, or like, these were so hard. And I try and keep that in mind when I'm thinking about my own assessments, where the first time that they engage with the questions that I write may not be as heavily weighted as other future assessments once they get some of that experience. And, you know, if they have previous experience working with multiple choice questions that move beyond the recall, I think they are less surprised or less shocked sometimes. So anecdotally, sometimes students find it challenging, especially when they get started. But generally, some students love multiple choice questions, some students hate them. I have found there is some really polarizing opinions. And I think that goes back to another answer that I shared earlier, where if there's an opportunity to combine some of these multiple choice questions with other ways to demonstrate their knowledge, I would always suggest that. I think multiple means of engaging with course material and assessments generally is useful, where students can select and have some autonomy in their own assessments and think about the best way that they can show that they know this stuff. But sometimes that's not always feasible when you're in those big classes. I totally understand those constraints. And so I would say some students say they love it, some students say they hate it, but it goes back to giving students the opportunity to contextualize themselves and figure out where they're at and get some practice. I don't think it should ever just be you only have 100% of your grade is on this one test. You've never seen how I write these questions before. Good luck. I think it's a little bit about scaffolding that into your assessments too. But I hope that answers your question, Lana. Students say a lot of things, so I couldn't cover it all in a couple minutes.
Yeah, I was just curious. It's always interesting. I mean, we always talk about it in our workshops and instructional skills development at LUMS about, you know, putting on that student hat, right? And seeing teaching from the student's perspective. So I think, I mean, assessment is such an important area, probably the most important area, at least to students, right? And so hearing, you know, from their perspective, and we always encourage instructors to do more of trying to hear from students' perspective by way of collecting feedback on their teaching regularly and that. So this is great. So Michelle, we're going to wrap up here and let people go, but you're getting a lot of love in the chat box here, which I hope you'll take time to just a second to read. And it was so lovely to have you here, and I hope we can have you back now that we have made connection. And thank you. We're going to circulate the video to everyone because I think people want to go back and kind of refer to what your tips as they're maybe working through some of their exam questions coming forward. So thank you so much. As we say, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया.
Thank you.
And yeah, I'll stay online for Hamayu is my student, so he's.
Well, thank you all so much for your kind words. I appreciate it. It was great to connect with you all. I am actually going to jet because I have another meeting, but wishing you
Okay.
all the best in your assessment, delivery, and design. And please know that, you know, it's about small steps. I hope you don't feel overwhelmed. I hope that, you know, take on, even if you just take on a little piece and try, like, honestly, just caring and trying is a big piece of the puzzle. And so thank you all for showing up and showing that you are willing to care and try. And Lana, it was so nice to see you.
It was so nice to see you. Say hi to my.
I will. Bye, everyone.
Thanks again, Michelle. We'll be in touch. Take care. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks. Bye, Amna.